Hello everybody and welcome to my little corner of the internet. My name's Michael and I'm bitten by a radioactive book. Today we're going to continue our guide to fantasy with the fifth part about urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is one of the terms that you will often see used to describe a fantasy just set in our real world. But actually, that's not the correct use of the term. As always, it's really easy to see what the genre is about by looking at its name, because when you look at urban fantasy, it says, yeah, it's a story that plays inside a town or inside a city. And that's really it. But what does that really mean? It means that the city itself becomes more or less of a protagonist or a character in the story. And let's look at how this is achieved. Most of the time you will find plots in urban fantasy that are kind of mystery plots. You have murder mysteries, you have like searches for a certain object, or the character is the main protagonist is the object of the desire for the bad guys, and he's chased around the town. So with every one of these like plot scenarios, you see one common denominator. Every plot is a plot that has the character moving and mobile. If you go through a murder investigation, or if you're looking for clues to find an object, or if you're chased by bad guys, what the characters will do, they will move around through the city. And that is one very important aspect to actually create the atmosphere of a city for the author. It's by showing the characters around. So the two most important things for an urban fantasy is that the author is able to establish this atmosphere, the atmosphere of the city, by showing you the two important P's: people and places. Now, if you think about it, if there's a city you have visited before, or maybe even lived in, if you think about it, then it might not be the same image as you've thought about the city before, because you only have like, yeah, there are some important landmarks that you know, or yeah, something you heard about the city, or maybe seen it in a movie. But if you actually visited a city or lived in a city, if you think about it, often it comes down to the places you've been visiting there, and the experiences you made there, and the people you met there. Because that is, yeah, actually how we create memories and connections. And this is something that the urban fantasy genre does really, really well. We take the main protagonist and let him move through the city, so he visits different significant places for the city, and of course he makes connections there through the people he meets or she meets in the city. Another thing you're often going to see with urban fantasies is that you have one protagonist, and the story is mostly or exclusively told from one perspective. I think that is my personal theory. I think that is to establish this connection between the character and the city a bit better. Because if you have a few different people, they might have different stories, and they might connect to the city differently, and that can distract from the way the author wants the reader to establish his connection to the city. Because it's way more easier if actually the connection the main character or the main protagonist has with the city becomes also the connection that the reader has. And that, I think, is more easy to establish with only or by only having one main protagonist instead of like having 5 or 6 running around. It is possible, we will see later on in the recommendation segment, that it's possible to do that as well, but most of the time you're going to see one protagonist in an urban fantasy. So if you look at it closely, urban fantasy is more of a genre that defines the setting. So we saw with other genres before that it's more about the characters and their motivations. So what you will often see is that other genres are also part of an urban fantasy story, because they are used to describe the motivations of the characters there, and the urban fantasy just gives us the setting. As I said, you see murder mysteries, mysteries as a whole, and also something we talked about last week, like the action adventure type sword and sorcery stories are often set in an urban fantasy setting, because it kind of complements each other. If you think about what we learned last week, that in sword and sorcery, the actions the characters take often only have an impact like their immediate surroundings. A surrounding like a city or a part of the city are the ideal setting actually for those kind of stories to happen. So you will find a lot of the urban fantasies that are actually set in secondary worlds to be sword and sorcery stories. So these two go together really well. Now let's head into the recommendations. First off, we have a story that I think is very typical, or the archetype of the urban fantasy story. It's Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, where our characters are brought to London Below, which is a kind of underworld below London where the people go that fall through the cracks. And it has its own kind of magic, it has its own kind of rules, and within this story the characters visit a lot of spots, or are under a lot of spots that we know actually from London. So we have the typical story here, because one of the main protagonists, Daw, wants to find out who killed her family, and so with the help of our main protagonist, Richard, and some other characters, she's moving around through the different spots of London Below, often marked as the subway stations, and so we get this atmosphere through the places she goes and through the people she meets there. Another series that is very often mentioned as urban fantasy, and you will see a lot around because it's one of the most popular ones, is the Dresden Files series by Jim Butcher. And it starts with Stormfront, and the Dresden Files follows Harry Dresden. He is a magician or wizard. He's doing detective work of the supernatural kind. So on the one hand, he gets like calls from people who want to have him investigate supernatural things, and on the other hand, he also works as consultant for police and is often consulted when strange and supernatural murder happened. The whole story is set in Chicago. The saga at the moment is at like, I don't know, 14 books, maybe even 15, I'm not sure yet. And of course, throughout the series and throughout each book, we have the same kind of thing we already talked about. We have murder mysteries, we have normal mysteries, and we have the character of Harry Dresden moving around the city, interviewing maybe other supernatural beings, being at certain places, and so that also invokes the feeling of this typical urban fantasy, and Chicago becomes a character of itself. And another interesting thing, last week we talked about covers, and Neverwhere was now a cover that was not that typical for urban fantasy, but at least if you saw it, it had the Big Ben on it. But actually, Stormfront is a typical cover for urban fantasy, because you see there is a character, and the character is depicted in front of a city kind of setting. And this is something you will see really often and repeated in the next covers that we're looking at, and so it's also an indicator for another kind of fantasy genre or subgenre where you can actually already know by picking up the cover what the story is all about. And you see that in our next cover as well. It's Something from the Night Side by Simon R. Green. This time we're going back to London, and if you look at the cover, you will also see there's like the male protagonist, and there is the city, the street setting around him. So, urban fantasy. This series is also a long-running series. I think it's in its 8, 9, maybe even more books, I'm not sure. And the Night Side is something very similar to London Below, because it also plays in London, but it's a place where the main protagonist can go and investigate stuff, and it's kind of a parallel, fantasy, hellish kind of world. And of course the main protagonist is also some sort of detective, and so you will get the usually tropey stories of murder investigations and lost and found, stuff like that. Next up, I'm going to show you a fantasy that is actually set in a secondary world, to show you that it's not all about having urban fantasy set in our world. It's a book you might have heard me talk about already. It's The City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. Again, look at the cover. You see a person on the top, and below that there is a cityscape. So you have the same thing, you have one character on it, and you have kind of a city panorama. So yeah, urban fantasy. And in this secondary world, the city of Bulikov is where the whole book is actually staged, and our main characters, Shara Tivani and her assistant slash bodyguard Sigrid, they're doing what we expect them to do at this point, a murder investigation. So again, you have this where they move around the city and they're collecting clues to see what the murder was all about, or who was behind the murder in the secondary world. Of course, if you're dealing with the secondary world, it's even more important to have like very remarkable landmarks, very memorable characters, because you don't have like a certain feeling about the city before. If the book is set in New York or London, you might already feel having a connection to that city, but of course when it's a fantasy setting you don't have this kind of connection, so it's very important to establish that connection, and Robert Jackson Bennett does this really well in his book. And last but not least, we are having Knights of Williammoor by Mark Sharon Newton. It's the first book in his Legends of the Red Sun series. And again, if you look at the cover, the character is actually very dominant, but if you are looking over his shoulder, then you will see, like very faded in the background, that there is actually again another city panorama. So again, we have a character, a main protagonist, and we have a cityscape. I mentioned earlier on that it doesn't have to be like one protagonist, and Mark Sharon Newton does something very interesting here, because he tries, and I think he also succeeds, to actually bring an epic fantasy feeling inside an urban fantasy setting, because the town, Williamore itself, is very memorable. They have like certain aspects. For example, the guards of the city are Garuda, and Garuda are like some winged demons, and they're flying above the city, and also doing like not really police work, but they establish order of some kind. And we also have something that I found very, very cool. We have the Banshees, and the Banshees are actually kind of women, and are kind of women. What kind of an explanation is that? The Banshees are women that have a kind of second sight, and they can foresee the moment of death for someone. And so whenever I think violent death, I'm not sure. So whenever somebody dies in the city by a violent death, a banshee is already there to witness it, and then when the death happens, she wails. And so every time when we hear the banshee wailing, we know that somebody has died in the city. And I really found that concept really cool, and that is something that really establishes the connection you get to the city quite early on. And Mark Sharon Newton goes another way and don't uses like one protagonist. He actually tells like an epic tale. We have a princess that comes into power because her father commits suicide, and now she has to come back to the city of Williamore and has to rule. We have a like kind of boy, maybe the orphaned boy, with a destiny, who comes to the city to make his luck. We have an investigator who investigates a murder mystery, so that is in there as well. We have a military commander who is the one who does all the military movements and security for the whole city. And I think the last one is like we have some kind of necromancer who strives for having eternal life. And of course, after we learned that urban fantasy is not the term to describe fantasy that is set in our world, then the question is, what kind of term is that going to be? And again, the answer is really easy. There is a term that is called contemporary fantasy, and that deals exclusively with stories that are set in our world. And contemporary fantasy, and how it is distinguished from the term of magical realism, what we also often see to describe fantasy elements set in our world. We will look at those two terms next week in the 6th part of the guide, and that will be about contemporary fantasy. That's it from me today. I hope you liked this little journey into urban fantasy. If you did, hit the like button. If you want to see more of me, subscribe to my channel. If you want to know what's coming up on my channel, please look inside the description box. There's a little segment there called On the Horizon. I wish you a good day and hope you get bit by a really good book too. Bye.